first thing we're going to do is remove the fan cowl. You just push out the 2 push pins. And then remove this small hose right here. Make sure you remove push pins on both sides. The next thing you have to do is remove the rest of the cowl. Make sure the expansion tank is tight. And remove the fluid level sensor up under the expansion tank. Now you want to go ahead and pull the hose out of the 2 restraints at the bottom. Lift the cowl up just a little bit, and you're going to have to tilt it the bottom end to the right to get it past the big hose over here on the left. And then just pull it up, and I just set a towel over the fender. Pull it out and rotate it. Just lay it on the fender. Okay, the next step is just to remove the plasma coils. I've already loosened all the nuts and bolts. I usually just take an extension with a 10mm long socket and spin them out, and you can just pull them all out. Then, instead of removing all the plasma coils individually, I usually just go ahead and pull out the ground with an 8mm and extension. Ground wire wasn't being nice today. And you can just remove all the plasma coils from this connection right here. Blow them out. Okay, that's everything off. Then you're going to want to go ahead and remove the HFM. Obviously the next part of this might be more or less difficult depending on what kind of manifold or lack thereof you have on your car. You're going to need to reach down to the back of the motor where it connects to the transmission, and you'll find a plug with a hole in the back. It's usually blue. It's usually a pain to get to. I usually use some kind of pick to grab it. then pull it out. Sometimes it's easier to get to up under the car. And then you're going to need 24mm socket. And just connect it to the front of the crankshaft. And you're going to want to crank the cams around. Make sure the car's out of gear. Definitely does not want to crank with the car in gear. You need to crank it around. And the cams will start coming up to the top. And once you get them about facing each other, that's going to be about TDC. You want to stop a little short before they face each other. And you're going to use a flywheel pin and stick it in that same hole that you just pulled the other pin out of. And then, once the pin pops in, you're at TDC. Then, if they didn't already come out, you want to go ahead and remove these 3 rear studs. One of mine came out. Usually this one comes out, but it didn't this time. You're ready to put the cam blocks on. They should fit flush. This one will not fit flush for me since the cams are timed 5 degrees retarded. As you can see, it's lifted up. Next, we remove the Vanos banjo line. Then we can remove both of those are 19s, and so is the banjo line. We take an inverted E10 Torx bit, and we're going to loosen the exhaust studs. I remove them all the way because the tool that I have won't allow it to sit flush with the studs in there, which is probably not a good thing. So if at all possible, you're supposed to leave the studs in there, but loosen them by less than one turn. Just so the sprocket's loose. Then just a piece of wire. You can use just stiff steel line used to depress secondary chain tensioner. And then you're going to loosen all the Vanos bolts, nuts. Or actually remove them, not just loosen them. You can usually get about a turn on them and then they remove them with your fingers. Next we're going to use the Vanos key turning tool. I'm just going to place it inside the exhaust sprocket. I guess more towards the left. And then you're going to rotate it clockwise and the Vanos will start moving off. You might have to wiggle it a little bit at the bottom and the top to get it to come off the dowels. But it'll come out. Then you remove the solenoid and the Vanos will slide out. Now, one thing that I've noticed is that if you jam it too hard, you will lift the edge of the block. You need to watch for that. If it lifts at all, well, mine's a different story just because the cams weren't timed straight up anyways, but they're going to be after this. So you want to adjust it back to TDC again and make sure the cams are timed with the block down. Now you can remove the exhaust studs for the ones that didn't pull it all the way out, which you're not supposed to. Then you can remove the nuts on the intake cam. I use magnetic trays for just about everything, but the intake cam Sorry, the battery went out on me. But depending on what you're working on, OBD1 or OBD2, all OBD2s have the second edition Vanos with a spring plate, and you're going to have a 4mm initial plate and then a 2mm on the front of the sprocket. It's kind of hard to get them confused, first of all, because they're different widths, but also they should have memory marks on it from what they connect to, and it makes it pretty obvious. Next we're going to remove the secondary sprockets with the chain. They just come off. If you can prevent it, I would not take them out of the configuration that they're in. In other words, don't remove them from the chain. Next, we can go ahead and remove the studs on the intake camshaft, which are 10mm. Again, you have to watch out for movement of the camshaft. If it moved at all, just get it back in place with a 24mm opening wrench. Once again, these studs come straight out, and I do not put them on anything magnetic. And one final plate. And then the trigger plate for the cam position sensor. Next, you're going to want to remove secondary chain tensioner. .10 millimeters. You're going to need an 1.25 inch open-end wrench. You can bring it down on the primary chain tensioner. Usually you can get it loosened just a little. And it'll come all the way out by just twisting. I'm pretty sure the Bentley and the TIS both tell you to remove the base chain guide right here. But every time I've done an install, I've never had to remove it. It just makes it easier to get the sprocket out. So if you want to remove it, by all means do it. Sprocket will come right off, and you can guide the chain off. You can usually just set it right there on top of the exhaust camshaft. And then I recommend zip tying it down, just so it doesn't fall down in there, because it's fun to fish out. Next, we're going to remove the pin, flywheel pin. Don't take it all the way out, just loosen it from the flywheel. And we're going to turn the engine approximately 30 degrees counterclockwise. We need to first remove all the studs that get in the way of the cam fixture. You can also remove the blocks from the back. Now this tool, not required, but definitely suggested. Goes into cylinders 1 and 4. Then you're going to use 17mm to crank it around until it begins to hit. And you want the holes to be pointing straight at you, putting the maximum pressure on the cam. Then you can just loosen all the studs, all the nuts, and remove the fixture. Okay, once you get all the studs off, you're going to use your 17 again. And this time, go slowly, and the cam's going to lift out. Make sure all your studs are off. If you hold your hand on the fixture, you can usually keep the cams from coming all the way out, and then continuing to crank. And then it'll become completely loose and make the holes point at yourself again. Lift up on the fixture a little bit, start removing. And make sure you keep everything in order, even though they are labeled. And then your cam's out. Here's the head with the cam tray removed. The best way to do it without using the bucket tapettes, these little suction cups. When you remove the cam, all the lifters are going to be in there, but if you lift the cam tray straight out, the lifters will fall out, and they're a real pain in the ass to get back in. So the best way to do it is just use some paper towels and clean off all of the inside of the cam tray, then spray it off with just a little bit of brake parts cleaner. Then dry all the brake parts cleaner out with more paper towels, and then spray it off with some compressed air. And then you can just use some painter's tape and just lay a strip of tape across the top of the lifters, and then just make sure they're pressed down. The tape's pressed down really hard on each top on top of each one, and then lift the whole tray out at one time, making sure none of the lifters fall off the tape. And then when you take the tray completely out, turn it upside down and leave it upside down until you put it back in. is the cam tray going back in. As you can see, I just put a piece of tape over the top of each lifter bucket to hold them there. Next, we're going to put the cam back in. The most important thing about this is just make sure that the first cylinder lobes are facing each other. And if you're putting in new cams, these are the same cams I took out of the car, then you want to oil them up really good before you put them in. I still put some oil on them, even though they've only been sitting out for 5 minutes. And then, like I said, you want to get them pretty close to the way they're going to be sitting inside the car. And start assembling in order. Okay, get everything tight down there. Grab your 17. Once again, make sure the cam's pretty close to where it needs to be. It does not have to be perfect. That's why you retarded the engine. And then just start twisting around. Making sure everything stays level and is not binding anywhere. Once again, push until everything's facing you. Make sure everything's flush everywhere. And straighten the cam. And then just put all the nuts on finger tight. And then you can remove the fixture and torque them down. Now you tighten all the 11mm camshaft bearing caps to 14 Newton meters when they're M7s. After you get both camshafts back in there, depending on what temperature it is outside, you need to wait a certain amount of time before you crank it back to TDC to allow the hydraulic lifters to re-extend. If you're at, I think, 20 degrees Celsius, you wait 4 minutes. 10 to 20 degrees Celsius, you wait 11. And anything less than 10 degrees, you need to wait at least half an hour. Now we're going to put the exhaust sprocket back on. The cam should be back in and have the blocks back on them. Okay, now this part is important. You need to have it so the holes on the sprocket line up oriented slightly to the left side of the holes. You're just going to keep moving the chain until you get to the point that you need it. A lot of people screw up right here by lining them up to the extreme left, but as you can see, if you push on it, it actually overlaps the hole a little bit, which is not what you want. Just keep moving the chain around. This should be it. See, the holes will line up slightly off the center to the left, and then if you pull it, they should come pretty close to the center now. It looks like they're pretty close, and that's how they'll line up once the primary chain is tensioned again. Now onto the intake camshaft. The studs are tightened to 20 Newton meters. And again, you might want to hold the camshaft just so it doesn't turn. If it does, it's not a huge deal. Check and make sure the exhaust sprocket's correct. First of all, you want the two arrows pointing straight up and straight down. And you take your tensioner tool and you insert it. And then you just tighten it finger tight, as tight as you can go with your fingers just on the end. And the hole should line up in the middle. Next, we're putting the secondary tensioner back on. The longest bolt goes on the bottom. Shortest goes in the back. And equal lengths go right there in the middle. Be careful when tightening these down. It's not that easy to strip the head with these, but it is easy to break the bolts. I haven't really found anywhere that set a good tightening torque for these. I know the Bentley doesn't say it, and neither does I haven't found it in the TIS. So just get them snug. And just to make sure everything clears okay, which it should. Next you're going to put on the cam sensor and the first washer, and just look for memory marks. You should have memory marks on both sides of what it looks like. And these three studs go down at 20 Newton meters, and it's a 10mm socket. Next we're going to put the secondary chain on. Another thing to mention about these studs, they look very similar to the valve cover studs, so watch out for that and make sure. I would just compare two of them and just know which ones you have and make sure you don't put the wrong ones in the wrong place. Next is putting on secondary chain. Now if you move the chain, this is going to be possibly harder on you than it should be. Should rotate freely, but the important thing is that when these studs are centered, they're also centered over here, which looks pretty good. The best suggestion is, if you're not sure, just rotate one tooth each way and it should be obvious that they're off centered either way. Again, memory marks on the outside, you can tell that goes on the outside. Then the smaller of the two washers for the intake. Then the spring plate, and then the thicker of the two washers. Once again, check for memory marks. There's a little bit of scoring on the inside of the plate. Just making sure I had that one the right way. 10mm nuts go back on, and they are tightened down to 10 Newton meters. Okay, now for the most difficult and probably the most prone to mistake portion of the install. We're going to put the vanos back in. First, you want to make sure that the spline is fully depressed. And you should already have your exhaust camshaft studs in there, finger tight, and then loosen about a half a turn just so the sprocket can still move. First, you take the sprocket and you rotate a little bit to the left, and then as far as it'll go clockwise, and make sure it goes all the way, because there can be a tendency for it to hang up just a little bit and not be fully seated all the way to the right. So clockwise first. Make sure your cams are still flush. Okay, then you want to place the spline into the vanos. Onto the vanos spline onto the camshaft, and you're going to make sure it stays depressed. Don't let it float out at all. And you're going to rotate it until it slides in just a little bit. See, like right now, it won't fall in, and if you rotate it, it'll slide in just a little bit further. You're going to take your vanos turning tool again. You're going to place it on the exhaust sprocket. You're going to put a little bit of pressure on the back of the vanos. It's better to have two people doing this. And then you're going to turn. And you caught the first tooth, which is a good thing. You want it to catch like right when you start turning your exhaust camshaft sprocket, the vanos should begin to pull in. Depending on whether you're installing a new vanos or not, it could be difficult to get the dowels aligned. This is a new vanos, so it's more difficult to get the to get the dowels seated. And most importantly, some procedures are very confusing on this. You want to pull the vanos in or turn the exhaust sprocket only until the vanos hits the head. You don't go until you stop, because then the vanos won't be able to advance at all. It'll just stay mechanically stuck. So pull it directly into the head, right till it hits the head, and then stop. And you're just going to finger tight all the nuts and the bolt on, and then torque them down. Again, as I'm thinking about it, make sure your cam blocks are still flush, because sometimes when you pull the vanos in, or like I said, when you're initially setting the secondary sprockets to the extreme right, you will mistime the cams. You need to check that, because once the vanos is on, you're not able to retime the cams again. Get all these studs on and just tighten them. This is another thing I've never really found the torque for. Just make sure they're snug. Okay, as I stated before, your exhaust stud should not be tightened yet. It should be finger tight and then loosen just a tad bit. Now you're going to remove the tensioner tool for the secondary tensioner. Chain's tight now. Your primary chain tensioner tool should still be in. Now with the primary chain tensioner tool still in, you're going to use a torque screwdriver to tighten it to 1.3 Newton meters. I've seen some instructions like Pelican Parts Do It Yourself that say that you don't have to use a torque screwdriver. They say you can use a finger wheel and tighten it as tight as you can go. But if you want to be completely accurate, it's best to use a torque screwdriver. You want to tighten till get the proper torque. Then you want to initially set your torque wrench to 5 Newton meters. Finger tight all of them. And then tighten to 5 Newton meters on each. And then bring it up to 20 for the final torque. Again, watch your camshaft to make sure it doesn't turn. The exhaust one's usually a little bit harder to make turn because it is connected to the crank directly. Okay, before you relieve the torque on the screwdriver, you want to remove the flywheel pin. Not all the way again. And you want to remove the blocks from the cams. And you want to crank the motor at least twice. Oh, let me make sure the pin is all the way out. It's going to be more difficult to turn than you're used to because you cranked it a few times with none of the chains connected. During this part of the install, or almost any part of the install besides when you're taking the cams out, you never want to turn the crank backwards because it'll loosen the chain on the primary tensioner and your timing will be thrown off. So just get it to go around twice. And then when you get close, you're going to put the pin back in. Okay. We can also loosen and remove the tensioner tool. And install the stock tensioner back. Before you put the stock tensioner back in, you want to take it and fully depress it. It's going to take more than one pump. Once you've done that, you can reinstall it with a 1 1/4 inch wrench. Okay, now you should pretty much be done, or we are pretty much done. Blocks fit on the back, and the only thing there is left to do is put the bolts back in the vanos, tighten them down with 19s. Just make sure they're snug. And then we can check the vanos. Travel. We just put the stock banjo line back on. You might want to check this hollowed out bolt and make sure that there's nothing crazy that fell inside it or anything like that. Before tightening it fully down, I usually stick an extension in, just so when you tighten it, it doesn't turn itself. You just want to make sure it's missing the oil filter housing. And just tighten it down. Okay, then we can plug in the solenoid. To finish up, you can just remove the blocks. You can remove the flywheel pin. It's definitely a good thing to do before you start the car. Make sure you put your cover back on. You can go ahead and remove whatever wrench you use for your 24mm. That's another good thing to remove before you start the car. And then install the spark plugs, all the head studs, all the valve cover studs, and then put the valve cover back on. Make sure that if you still have an air pump, you run the line and connect it to the check valve, and make sure you put the crankcase hose back to the valve cover. Other than that, it's just buttoning it up, putting the plasma coils on, and you're done.